Alright, on this slide here, we're going to be looking at the major bones of the skull. Now, we're going to start from the front view of the skull here. And from the front view of the skull, you can see several prominent bones. The first one is the front bone right here that makes up your forehead. This is the frontal bone. Now, the frontal bone extends all the way back from this line here. This is the coronal suture. And the frontal bone goes all the way back and back underneath the eyelids. Now, still on the front side of the skull, you're going to see this bone right here. Okay, this is your cheekbone or zygomatic bone. Attached to this is now the zygomatic bone has another mate on the other side. These are two paired bones. The frontal bone is a singular bone. Just like this bone down here, the mandible or lower jaw. These two bones, the mandible and the frontal bone, do not have a mate, but the zygomatic bone or your cheekbones and the maxilla do have mates, left and right. Now, still on the front of the skull, you see these two bones right here. These are their nasal bones. Now, the rest of the nose is made up of cartilage that comes out, but these are the two parts right here that are actually paired, a right and a left nasal bone. From in here, from this view also, you can see this part right here. This bone that looks like the front end of a plow, that's called the vomer bone. Vomer actually means plow. From the side view of the skull, you can still make out the frontal bone. You can still see the coronal suture coming around here from the side. And everything to the front here is the frontal bone. And again, you can still make out the zygomatic bone. Now, this part right here is the zygomatic arch, which is made of both the zygomatic bone and this bone right here that you could see from this side view. You couldn't see this from the front. This bone right here is the temporal bone. You'll find this just on the temples of your skull. And just above those, you have paired bones, the parietal bone. The parietal bone goes all the way back from the occipital bone in the back, which you can barely make out back here, and the temporal bone, and extends all the way up to the middle of the skull, where you see this sagittal suture that runs back and forth and divides your skull into right and left halves. Now, from this side view, one of the most prominent features that you need to know is this roughened extension of the temporal bone. This is called the mastoid process. Now, the mastoid process is a nature landmark. You can reach back behind your ear and you actually feel a solid bump. And you can tell it's really close to the ear because right here is the opening that would take your ear canal, carry the nerves back into your brain. Now, the back view of the skull, you'll see the suture that goes across and down. This is the lamboid suture, and this separates the parietal bones from the occipital bone. Okay, this occipital bone is the back part of your skull. Now, there's several things you need to remember about the occipital bone, several notable features. First of all, here's this big bump right back here, which is the point of attachment for many of your back muscles. The muscles pull on here and pull your head upright. Now, from this view also, you can see right down here this huge opening. This opening is called the foramen magnum. This is the opening through which the spinal cord passes through and becomes continuous, with the vertebrae. And you have these two rounded portions right down here that are going to connect to the atlas bone, first part of the vertebral column, and this is going to form a pivot point where these bones are going to move back and forth. They form the allanto-occipital joint. Now, on this model here, this is a plastic model, you see a little structure right down here. This is the styloid process. On most natural bone skeletons, these processes are lost, because they break off very easily, but on a plastic model like this, you can see this. Again, this is another point of many muscle attachments here that control like your throat. Now, two other bones that you have on your chart here that you need to know are very hard to see from the outside. We're going to try and show them to you here. The first one is the ethmoid bone. From the inside, you can see it here. That's going to make up part of the eye orbit, the inside portion in here. That's the ethmoid. You'll also have the sphenoid bone. Now, the sphenoid bone is this one here that kind of looks like a moth or a bat, right through here. Okay, and again, this is going to make up the lateral walls of the eye orbit and part of the lowest part of the skull. Now, in the sphenoid bone, you have this little part here called the coelica tunica. This part is where the pituitary gland rests, so it's well protected because that is considered the master gland, which we'll study more when we do the endocrine glands. Finally, as part of the skull, really didn't know where else to put this bone. It's a very, very small bone, as you can see here. As we zoom out to give you an idea of the size, it's really quite small. This bone is called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is the one that I jokingly call the orphan bone, because this is the only bone in your body that does not form a connection with another bone anyplace else in the body. This one sits underneath your chin, back of your throat. This is the one that a forensic scientist, if they see that they suspect a murder victim has been strangled, this bone, being very, very small and delicate, will be crushed. An idea about where the hyoid bone sits. It's going to sit mid-anterior, right about in here. Now, it's going to be attached by ligaments to these styloid processes that I showed you earlier. Again, these styloid processes are generally broken off in a natural bone skeleton, but in a plastic model, you can see where they would sit. And in this position right here, you can easily see how this bone could be broken or crushed if a murder victim is being strangled.